The meaning of the Great War. Necessary or mistake? The meaning of the Great War. Necessary or mistake? To simplify this question, we're going to look at three historians and their interpretations of the war, this being Gary Sheffield, pictured on the top right, and Max Hastings, pictured on the top left. Both historians have similar interpretations of the war, this being that the war was necessary. Both use the idea of curbing German militarism as their argument. Gary Sheffield writes, the war was started by the leaders of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Venice seized the opportunity presented by the assassination of the Archduke to attempt to destroy its Balkan rival in Serbia. He also says Britain went to war with Germany in August 1914 for similar reasons to those for which the country fought Hitler's Germany in the Second World War, to prevent an authoritarian, militaristic, expansionist enemy from achieving hegemony in Europe and thus imperiling British security. Max Hastings writes a lot about the war, but most importantly, he says the First World War had to be fought because of the threat posed by German militarism. It was a conflict whose outcome would decide the future of Europe and the fate of the modern world. On the other side of the spectrum, we see our third historian, Niall Ferguson. He writes, Britain could indeed have lived with the German victory. What's more, it would have been in Britain's best interest to stay out in 1914. We should not think of this as some great victory or dreadful crime, but more as the biggest error in modern history. So, in my opinion, the war is too complex to be measured in whether it was right or wrong. Instead, using what we learned throughout the term, I think my answer falls between the two arguments. It's the factors that we'll explore that show that the war was necessary for shaping Europe, yet also fails by conflicting untold horrors on the people of Europe and setting the stage for the events that later created the atmosphere for World War II. To simplify my argument, I believe the war was a mistake due to the high costs in lives and resources. This is being seen by the 38 million total casualties and destruction of Europe, this being devastation inflicted on the Western and Eastern Front. Also, we have the Treaty of Versailles. Its humiliation of Germany led to a radicalization of the population and sparked led to World War II. Finally, a psychological and social damage inflicted on the soldier and civilians, this being seen in the aftermath of the war or through PTSD and the idea of the lost generation. Flipping to the other side, the reason I think the war was necessary is due to the political landscape and turmoil in Germany prior to the World War I, this being showcased in the awful German parliament and the rise of the Social Democratic Party in Germany as a response. Like Gary Sheffield and Max Hastings, I think the war was necessary to curb German militarism. You can see this in their policy of Weltpolitik and the idea of cutting the knot. These were used to fight against the reform in Germany, which will later be explored. Finally, I think the war was necessary as it paved the way for nationalism and a call for freedom among the oppressed people within these empires, specifically in the Central Powers. We can see this in the Slavic nationalism after the Bosnian crisis and the Armenian genocide. When I use the term political turmoil, I'm referring to the injustice done to the people in terms of their political situation in Germany. For some context, Otto von Bismarck united Germany into a modern nation state in 1871. Germany was a constitutional monarchy on paper. It wasn't a solid empire as most today understand, but a federation of German states and kingdoms. But as Burgon argues, it was not only the finances of the Reich, the federal states that were coming apart at the seams, but the political system in general. German parliament was separated into two houses, the Reichstag and the Bundestag. The Reichstag was the lower house, directly elected by the people through universal male suffrage. It represented the population of the entire empire, and its duties were proposing and debating new laws. The Bundestag was the upper house. This encompassed the aristocratic elites. To understand the idea and the issue with the German parliament, we have to look at the divide in representation. Prussia held 17 out of 61 seats, yet held only 2% of the population. This means, however, they elected one-third of the electors. This being an issue when any reform or law proposed by the Reichstag, because it could be blocked by 14 votes. The Kaiser and the King of Prussia had full executive power to appoint and disarm ministers and dissolve the Reichstag with the permission of the Bundestag, reducing it to a weak debating body. So to reiterate, the Kaiser had the ability to put his friends in the Bundestag and therefore control the laws being produced by the Reichstag because they had the power to veto any reform or law. With the obvious injustice in Germany, Social Democratic Party, which was a revolutionary socialist party in rhetoric but formless in nature, gained major popularity with people. In 1912 Reichstag election, 4.5 million votes were gained and 110 seats were obtained by the Social Democratic Party in the Reichstag. The Kaiser, for a long time now, had established the anti-socialist laws to curb these groups, and this political alienation of the people created the notion of people versus elites, or everyday worker versus elites. To relate this to why I think the war was necessary, I think the war, and specifically a German loss in the war, was necessary for inspiring reform and changing the political landscape for Germany. Although in execution we know that the war gave rise to Hitler and the Nazi regime, and although I'm not trying to credit Hitler, but he did speak to the ideals of the working class and represented the ideals of the people prior to World War II. World War II. He captured their feelings that after the war, and although he manipulated that platform for total control, the Nazi Party did win multiple elections. These were by the people of Germany. Moving on to my second point, this being the idea of German militarism and imperialism. Giving context, we can look at the Prussian militarism, and it got carried over to Germany. Germany's foreign policy before World War I, which aimed to make Germany a global power. This was Weltpolitik. This term translates to world politics. This is seen in the Morocco crisis, the Algiers crisis. These are both were diplomatic issues between France and Germany um, over the control and influence of Morocco. Also, we have the naval arms race between Great Britain and Germany. And finally, the idea of containment. This being the idea that Germany, through a coalition of the Allies, were being cut off from natural expansion. Cutting the knot. This refers to a complex or intractable problem that is solved by a sudden, bold, and decisive action that quickly resolves. Weltpolitik was the German solution, a version of social imperialism. Its purpose to avoid the Staatsreich or coup d'état and to keep a lid on revolution, also to integrate the nation. Spirit of 1914, at the onset of World War I, there was a widespread belief in Germany that the war could be won quickly. Just to reiterate, Germany believed that a quicker war and decisive win would unite the people and distract its people from the issues going on back home. This idea was also expressed in Russia during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, but failed. Robic Alaric writes, democratic policies could no longer be postponed. Henceforth, the problem was how to manipulate them. To back up my argument, Burgon writes, so in essence, this assertive war policy was embarked by Wilhelm to divert attention away from the troubles back home and partly to appeal his own vanity. So relating to this why the war was necessary, prior to our term, I would have said the war was inevitable, but a better way to look at this statement is the war was brought on by perceived notions and traditions in combination with social upheaval. Germany's unrestricted military brought fear to the Allied powers, and at the first sight of conflict, they jumped on board to curb German militarism. This ego, combined with the Prussian elites, led to a powder keg of tension waiting to be ignited. The Bosnian crisis. This was a diplomatic conflict sparked by Austria-Hungary's annexation of the territories in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This annexation resulted in Austrian oppression. This included censorship of media and political meetings, and assimilation of the population. This is seen by Austrian officials banning the use of Serbo-Croatian, the language in Bosnia, and forcing the use of German in schools. The Schutzkorps was a military force used to quell rebellion and occupy the region during the time. Historian Arviel Roschwald writes, the Austro-Hungarian authorities believed that the Serbs in Herzegovina were likely to launch an anti-Habsburg rebellion. The Armenian genocide can be seen as a tragic manifestation of extreme nationalism. By the early 20th century, Armenians had established various nationalistic movements that sought greater rights, autonomy, and independence. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation was a group of people fighting for those rights, and the Ottoman government, in the name of Turkish nationalism, sought to eliminate the Armenian population to ensure its survival of the Turkish state. World War I facilitated the spark for revolution, freeing the oppressed people from these great empires. Following the war, we saw the creation of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Armenia, and many other Baltic states. The idea is that the war created the situation for these states to get created, thus leading to these people's freedoms. Woodrow Wilson writes in an address to Congress, the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. Shifting to why I believe the Great War was a mistake, let's look at the high cost in lives and resources. This table, courtesy of Encyclopedia Britannica, we see the war totals, around 38 million casualties and 9 million dead. Historian Roger Kirkreich writes, civilians were cast in roles no less essential than soldiers, while commercial warfare, strategic bombings, and the shelling of population centers carried the war to the home front and eroded the last practical distinction between soldiers and civilians. Looking at the blockades, the German naval blockade of the British Isles, initiated in 1914, aimed to prevent the import of essential goods Through their unrestricted U-boat campaign, around 5,000 British merchant ships were destroyed, killing unknown numbers of civilians. And looking at British blockade on Germany, this caused severe economic problems, leading to a sharp decline in the availability of food and raw materials in Germany. Another thing usually forgotten in the war is the devastation of Europe's lands. On the Western Front, we see the most physical destruction in the regions of France and Belgium, this being examples like Verdun, Ypres, and Arras. On the Eastern Front, we didn't see the same amount of trench warfare, so it wasn't as heavily impacted, but there's still devastation in present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. Also, the Great War's weapons were still being unearthed, this being seen by unexploded shells and other explosives that are still being found today, most commonly in Belgium. And chemical warfare, the impact of the agriculture crisis after the war. So, kind of an obvious notion, but the Great War was a mistake due to its unprecedented loss of life and destruction for Europe. No distinction between civilian and combatant, displacement of civilians, and it indebted these nations to the U.S. and other nations untouched by the warfare through building and reliance on trade. Shifting to the Treaty of Versailles and its humiliation of Germany, Germany's leadership after the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II hoped to surrender according to President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. This treaty would have included free trade, open diplomacy, disarmament, and the League of Nations. But conflicting Allied goals called for harsher punishment, including blaming Germany for the war's inception. Known as the War Guilt Clause, this placed full responsibility for the war squarely on Germany and all of its allies. This included also territorial losses, including the colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This isolated Prussia. They lost Alsace and Lorraine to the French. The Rhineland was demilitarized, along with other military restrictions, and reparations to the Allied powers caused economic hardship. So the radicalization of the people, the humiliation of Germany caused upheaval among the population. They turned to more radical politicians, including Hitler, a veteran of the World War and veteran of the First World War. These factors sparked the rise of extremist political movements, especially the Nazi Party, who capitalized on these feelings of injustice, feeling a national backlash with calls to overturn the treaty and restore lost territory and honor. This climate of discontent and radicalization helped pave the way for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, which ultimately led to the World War II. It's widely known that the Treaty of Versailles was the catalyst for World War II. As the Allied powers hoped to weaken Germany, they instead radicalized the people, leading to even more deadly conflict. Historian Jay Winter writes, "What was unthinkable, what was unimaginable about human brutality changed between 1914 and 1918. And without the shifting representation and perception, the worst events of the Second World War would not have been possible." Looking at the mental and social damage brought on by events like PTSD, soldiers who had endured the war and its awful conditions, trench warfare, sometimes developed a neuropsychiatric syndrome known as various names, but more commonly known as shell shock. Symptoms include tremors, uncontrollable shaking, paralysis, blindness, and deafness. After the war, many soldiers who had suffered from shell shock were left without adequate care, and many faced social stigma when they returned home. The physical destruction caused by World War I had profound lasting impacts on soldiers, civilians, and societies, with millions of men wounded, mutilated, and or permanently disfigured, many of whom were amputees, had severe facial deformities, and became subject to paralysis and chronic disability. The war forced a revaluation of social norms and the value of human life. The lost generation was not only just a group of people who lived through the First World War. It was a generation fundamentally altered by the war's psychological and social consequences. Many soldiers and civilians grew disillusioned with the idea of patriotism and the notion of the war as a noble endeavor. Mass unemployment. Many veterans struggled to find work and were left with little financial support, leading to the social unrest and increased dissatisfaction with governments. Dadaism and surrealism emerged as a way of processing the absurdity of the war and breakdown of traditional values. Some of the notable figures are F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hugo Ball. They both, in their respective fields, challenged the ideas of war and its effect on the population that endured it. Psychological and social damage caused a disillusionment among many veterans of the returning home from the First World War. The psychologically and physically damaged people became alienated in the population. Also, a profound shift and decline in social values and norms occurred. Think, you come home, your job that you had prior to the war is gone, the one that was promised you. If you were a student, you've just wasted 4 years of your life and you have no work skills. If you're from the Central Powers, especially Germany, your country is destroyed. Hyperinflation brought on by reparations has made your money worthless, and all the while, it's expected that we just forget, move on. How would you cope? In conclusion, the Great War, for its destruction, was necessary for the advancements of political systems, curbing unprecedented militarism, and the advancements for freedom from oppressive empires. Yet, the war was a mistake for its catastrophic devastation measured in lives lost and land destroyed, its effects also leading to World War II, and its psychological damage left on by generations that lived through the conflict. Thank you.